Chapter 1. Anthropology, the study of human beings and their creations.
The Greek word for man is anthropos, and the word anthropology has been in the English language for centuries. But just what does the word mean? Well, literally, anthropology means the study of man. However, as British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead noted, it's a well-founded historical generalization that the last thing to be discovered in any science is what the science is really about. And as Paul Bohannon, renowned anthropologist, pointed out a number of years ago, each science that deals with people has its own definitions of human. An economist, he explains, defines a human as a choice-making animal. Philosophers define man as a rationalizing animal. Anthropology attempts to be all-inclusive, the study of human behavior in all places and throughout time. It specializes in the description of humanistic, scientific, biological, historical, psychological, and social views of humans. Now, to paraphrase Barbara Miller's statement in her textbook, Cultural Anthropology, the popular impression of anthropology is based mainly on movies and television shows that depict anthropologists as adventurers and heroes. Well, now some do have adventures and discover treasures in Egyptian tombs and elsewhere, but mostly their work is less glamorous and involves repetitive and tedious activities. Now, until around the middle of the 19th century, anthropology was a term used for all humanists. Now, my lecture today explains the fields and branches of anthropology. Now, we're going to begin by stating that anthropology is the study of human behavior in all places and at all times. Now, Western civilization takes credit for the development of anthropology, which, as a matter of fact, was a relatively late science. Earlier Greek and Roman philosophers were more interested in speculating about the ideal society rather than describing those known to them. Now, after the onset of the Age of Exploration, which included the discovery of the Americas, as well as travel to other distant places, the study of non-Western people began in earnest. In modern day, anthropology is a recognized social science with two broad fields and several branches or subfields. Now, the two broad fields are physical anthropology and cultural anthropology. Let me give you a brief description of each. Physical anthropology is concerned with the development of man as a mammal. Related subjects are anatomy, biology, and paleontology. Now, physical anthropologists study the evolution of the human species. And one way they do this is by the comparative analysis of fossils, preserved remnants of once living creatures and living primates, which include human beings or Homo sapiens. Common fossils are shells, bones, and molds or imprints. Now, these are found buried in the earth or permanently frozen in glaciers. Living primates are analyzed in order to study the mechanics of evolution and genetic differences among human populations. Now, let's talk about cultural anthropology. This field is the study of learned behavior in human societies. Now, most cultural anthropologists limit themselves to a few geographic areas. For example, Margaret Mead in Samoa and New Guinea, and Clyde Kluckhohn with the Navajo Indians in the southwestern United States. And I should mention that Kluckhohn's work, Mirror for Man, is considered one of the best introductions to anthropology. Now, cultural anthropology and the scientific study of human culture will be discussed in more detail in our next lecture. The subfields of cultural anthropology are archaeology, linguistics, and ethnography. Archaeology is the study of different cultures through material sources rather than direct interviews or observations of the group under study. One example of a famous archaeological site discovered in the past century was King Tut's tomb near Luxor, Egypt in 1922. Linguistics, as you probably know, is the study of language as communication among humans. Culture is learned and transmitted primarily through language. Ethnography is the systematic description of human societies, mostly based on first-hand fieldwork. Based on ethnographies, anthropologists provide ethnologies or explanations of behavior of different peoples. Now, the second subfield of ethnography is social anthropology. Now, social anthropology is concerned with people as social beings. A related subject, of course, is sociology. Let me also mention briefly psychological anthropology, which deals with human personality and feelings. Now, these are greatly influenced by an individual's biological and mental characteristics, as well as physical surroundings and personal experiences. Related subjects there are psychology and psychiatry. Now, it's important to note that there are several universals common among all societies. For example, the basic similarities in human biology and the existence of two sexes. Another of these is education, either formal or informal or both. Education is necessary to provide the young with the skills and attitudes needed to carry on as adults. So you might ask, what are the practical applications for such a broad field? Well, the answer is that anthropology helps us plan the future and helps us contribute to the solution of human problems. This newest area of the study of man is applied anthropology. Now, formerly, anthropology was limited to the academic field. Anthropologists were teachers or museum curators. But for the past several decades, large numbers of anthro graduates have been employed in fields such as urban planning and administration, healthcare, and international development. Now, most important is that although anthropologists have taken up the task of documenting the processes and changes of cultures past and present, they also provide the necessary insight into where the human species is heading.